Hi, it's Dr. Parikh, and we're ready to write your research question. This really forms the foundation for the research proposal. This is you saying what it is that you are looking for in your paper. Remember, you're not actually going to do the study, but I still want you to ask a very realistic question, a well-crafted question. So it's going to be very simple because you have to write up how you're going to analyze it, and you probably haven't taken stats. So we want to keep it very, very simple. And I want to be able to use rubrics like I do for everything else, which means everybody's has to be formatted pretty much the same way. So let me see, where am I? So over here is the template for the research question. And I've made it kind of 3 pretty simple steps, but all you need to include is the bit at the top. And what I do, I have you start with 2 questions. Just because it gives us more options. Now, they can be very similar if you want, or they can be pretty different. And when I look at it, I will give you feedback on each one. Typically, if one of them's way off base and the other one's pretty good, I'll probably focus on the one that's better. But often I'll say, okay, here's some feedback, if any, and then pick which one you want. So no matter what, you are going to need to submit this assignment twice. It's one of the ones that you do until I'm happy with it. And so at a minimum, you submit it once, I give you some feedback about how appropriate it is, and I end with, at least, tell me which one you're going to do. So I want you to make a commitment so I know what to do going forward. So you're going to do it at least twice. Sometimes it's a back and forth. Sometimes there's 3 or 4 submissions before we get it right. So your research question, so a research question is more just an open question, like, do men or women experience depression more frequently? That's a question because it ends with a question mark. A hypothesis is actually what I have you focus on here. And the hypothesis is where you make a claim that you're going to test. So that might be women experience depression more frequently than men. So hypotheses are not questions, they're statements. And then you test the data to see if that statement is true or not. So I have you write it as a hypothesis, and I have you identify the independent and dependent variables. So the independent variable is the thing that we are messing with or that we think is going to predict a change in something else, and the dependent variable is the outcome that we're measuring. So in the example I just gave, do men or women will experience depression more frequently than men. So for that, we can't actually mess with whether you're a man or woman. I mean, theoretically, you could do different things to raise someone's awareness of gender norms versus not. But we're not going to change whether you identify as male or female. So the independent variable would be gender. And in this case, I'm going to specify men and women because there are people who identify as neither male nor female. We also have trans individuals. And you may or may not care whether they're trans as long as they identify as either male or female. But for this, we need an independent variable that has 2 different levels because that's part of the analysis that we're using. We're using what's called a t-test, which is where you compare 2 different groups on a continuous variable. So for example, height is continuous because you can be anywhere along that path. It doesn't need to be continuous. It just needs to have different numbers. So it could be something where you have to choose 1, 2, 3, or 4. So it's not continuous and that you don't have, a million possible spots along the way. But it just needs to be numbers that are meaningful. So you can't do rank order like first, second, third. That doesn't work the same as like 1, 2, 3, or 4. So you choose an independent variable that has 2 levels. You could also be designing some sort of intervention. So half the people get this therapy treatment, the other half get nothing or just follow up with their doctor or something like that. Or you could say, okay, half the people are put in a red room while they do this art, the other half are put in a white room while they do an art project and see how see how their stress levels are different at the end. Whether art projects are more helpful in a simple environment or a saturated color environment. It could be whatever you want it to be, but you need to have two different conditions for people, either pre-existing, so a demographic factor, or something you're doing, an intervention. And then you also will say your dependent variable. So the dependent variable is almost always going to be scores on a measure. And for this, you don't get to just make up questions. That's not good research. Good research uses sets of questions that we already know have meaning. I've mentioned a lot of times, for grade school children, foot size is like a decent-ish measure of reading ability. That doesn't mean that it's a good measure. So this class, I'm always torn, how much do I teach writing versus how much am I teaching experimental methods? And so when I first started teaching, I had students choose their own measures, and a lot of students would say, well, what's a measure? And I would say, fair question. So a measure is just a group of questions. It can be sometimes you might have tasks like, let me see, the MOCA, the Montreal Cognitive. Let me see. Oh, my internet's being weird. Let me see if I can. I think if I had fully downloaded the file, it would have played nicer. But I'm going to show you, this is one of the ones you can use. It's the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which is called the MOCA. And this one is one that so most measures you can just email to people and have them fill out. That's how a lot of research happens. The MOCA is one where you have to design your study so that the person comes into the lab and actually is given the test by an interviewer, by a trained interviewer. And so there's things like you have to name what the different pictures are of, you have to draw a clock with a particular time. And so this is a test of, it's really looking for dementia issues. Now for this class, I've tried to choose kind of broad measures, but there are a lot of times students are going to just have to go with the best fit. So if you're doing a measure of, something with depression, that's easy. We have a depression measure. If you're doing postpartum depression, we have a postpartum depression measure. So some people are going to find a perfect fit. Other people are going to have to pick something that approximates what they're interested in. So the MOCA is a way to approximate anything related to dementia, but also you can use it for things related to cognitive abilities, or I would even potentially let you use it for intelligence. And and I know that it's not really meant for that, but it's really tough to write up those bigger things. And so I try to be a little flexible on your research questions, as long as if it's something that I've already prepped for you, I'm going to do my best to keep it kind of broad, or to be broad-minded about how you apply those. Now, if you want to do an intelligence test and you want to use your own measure, something I didn't put together for you, and it's terrible for intelligence, that I'm going to treat differently. Because the whole point of me giving you, let's go back and look at what I give you for the research questions. So I give you this one sheet that has the name of the measure, the acronym if it's used. It has the reference that you should use that's sort of the earliest, as far as I could tell, the earliest published version of the measure, to give credit for who built the measure, because a lot of work goes into developing a good measure. And then I go through the purpose, subcategories, that's a weird word I chose that moment. Subscales is really a better word for it. The age range, so sometimes things are meant for children or adults. Language, if there's, so for example, this one has been translated into a lot of other languages. So you could check to see if it's been if you want to work with a particular population, you could just use Google to try to see if the measure you're interested in has been used with that population, and you can write it up to use that language version. Population restrictions would be, is there anyone that it's really not meant to be used with? Format, again, usually it can be done paper or pencil or online. But in this case, it's a clinician interview. So you have to have an in-person interview. You have to, when you explain your study, you have to explain it to be an in-person. How many items, a sample item, the response style, how it's scored, including sort of what does a high score mean? In this case, lower scores indicate greater cognitive impairment. So it's always important to tell people which, we don't use the terms good or bad, but it's sort of like, is a high score a good thing or a bad thing? And then cutoffs, if there are particular ranges that are designated with some sort of clinical significance. And then anytime I can, I include a link of some sort to the actual measure. So I've done this for kind of a variety of things. You'll have to just peek through and see different things. Here, when I pull it up, let me expand the web page a little bit. I have it pulled up in Drive. If you hit, there's a little button that lets you see it as a list rather than a grid. Why is it making the names so small? I don't know why it's doing that. That's kind of annoying. Maybe because I'm not signed in there. Let me pop over to my Google Drive folder and see if anything is better. Measures for research proposals. Yeah, this way it's showing up a little more logically. But if you look at the whole list, I don't know why it's being weird. But the names have a little more information in them. If it's being weird like this for you, honestly, what I would do is just download all of them and look at them that way, because it's just being weird. I've selected one now. Of course, now I can't figure out how to do it. Yeah, you can just download the whole. Here, you saw me click one click and I'm downloading the whole thing. But I've meant to do this to make your life easier. If there is another measure you want to use, certainly we can talk about it. Right now I don't have anything great with substance abuse, I think. That's one thing that's really missing. And the risk of doing something different is that you will lose points if you can't find certain items. Some things like languages or ages, that I usually don't get too fussy about. But things like a sample item, I'm really particular about that, because when I read articles, I think it's really, really helpful when there's a sample item. I keep debating. One other thing that's almost always reported in high quality journal articles is the Cronbach's alpha, which is a measure of the internal consistency. So if I answer high on one question, how likely am I to answer high on other questions in the same scale or subscale? So how consistent do answers tend to be for people? You'll notice sometimes when you take a test, it seems like you're answering the same question worded slightly differently several times. That's because they're trying to assess whether you're answering the same way for several questions that are worded a little differently. So Cronbach's alpha is a very standardly reported measure. I haven't typically included it because it's so far down the road. It's something that usually you would worry more if you were writing an honors project or in grad school. But I keep debating, so you may see that show up. And that's something I may go back and add in for old ones, or I might just tack on in the results somewhere a statement about it. And I talk you through here. I've tried to walk through kind of the steps of how you choose things. If you feel like the video was enough and you've got a good question going, I don't know that you need to go through that. But if you're still a little stuck, you can certainly read through it. You upload your questions. I honestly would prefer if you just copy and paste the questions themselves for this one. There's not a lot of formatting that goes with it, and that way I don't have to fuss with the document. Although you could still include a link if you're using a Google Drive, and maybe I'll pop right over to your Google Drive to look at it to make any comments I need. If there's a topic you're really interested in and you're not sure how to make it fit with the research question format, email is the best way. So if you make sure when you're ready to upload that you're uploading something that you genuinely think will work. If you're not sure if it'll work, email me and we'll chat about it over email. I check my email a lot more a day or a week even than I check assignments that need grading. And especially if you're working ahead thinking like, oh, this way she can give me feedback. The problem is I'm often trying to use my time the best I can with the to-do list I have. And so when people do assignments early, I don't necessarily pop in and grade them because it's much faster for me to sit down and grade all of one thing at one time. So if you want to work ahead and you want some feedback, just email me to let me know. I can't double grade it, so I'm not going to grade it ahead of time, but if you just want to know if you're on the right track, I can certainly do that, especially with an assignment like this, where really the format is you keep doing it and I give you a 0 until I feel like you have something that's going to work well, and then I give you full credit. That's that. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.